Protests in Afghanistan today grew more violent and more bloody as anger and distrust for Americans there grows. The protests are in response to the burning of several holy books, or Qurans, at the Bagram Air Base. According to the military officials, those books were tossed in the incinerator because prison officials believed they were being used by prisoners to communicate with one another. But most Muslims consider the Quran to be the literal word of God, and desecration is considered one of the worst forms of blasphemy. Now, this is not new information, and yet it happened anyways. And in response, there have been several days of violent protests. Yesterday, a man wearing an Afghan military uniform shot and killed 2 American soldiers, and at least 20 other people have also been reportedly killed. Now, soon after this incident was reported, high-ranking Americans did come forward and issue apologies.
I'm General John Allen, commander of the International Security Assistance Force. I've ordered an investigation into a report I received during the night that ISAF personnel at Bagram Air Base improperly disposed of a large number of Islamic religious materials, which included Qurans.
President Obama also issued an apology in a letter he wrote to Afghan President Hamid Karzai, in which he expressed regret that the religious materials were, quote, unintentionally mishandled at Bagram. But the president's apology came several days after the incident, and many people who live in Afghanistan say it's simply not enough.
Apologies are not enough. They have to be put on trial, and the culprits should face the law.
So how will this incident affect the current war in Afghanistan? And how could this have been handled differently? To help me answer some of those questions, I'm joined by Derek Crow, Policy Director at Brave New Foundation. Derek, it appears that these apologies from the president, from the general, are falling on deaf ears.
Well, it's falling on deaf ears because I think you're right that the people of Afghanistan aren't particularly moved by these apologies. I think the continuing violence shows that. And I think the reason that they're not particularly moved by it is that this is one of several ongoing cultural insults being perpetrated by the occupation forces there, not least of which is the frequent invasion of Afghan homes by U.S. Special Operations Forces. And when you have a situation where a foreign force is in your country, repeatedly violating the cultural standards of your country, it's absolutely understandable that just saying you're sorry is not going to get you anywhere.
Not going to get you anywhere, but there are quite a few people who say, you know, at least it's a step in the right direction. However, there seems to be sort of a mindset, especially among conservative politicians in this country, that it was the wrong thing to do. I want to play a little bit of a speech that presidential candidate for the GOP, Newt Gingrich, recently said.
The president apologized for the burning. But I haven't seen the president demand that the government of Afghanistan apologize for the killing of 2 young Americans. If Hamid Karzai, the president of Afghanistan, doesn't feel like apologizing, then I think we should say goodbye and good luck. We don't need to be here risking our lives and wasting our money on somebody who doesn't care.
So your thoughts on this, Derek? I mean, Newt Gingrich is one of the 4 candidates. He's still in this race. Talk to me about this mentality.
Well, I think Gingrich and any other presidential candidate who tries to play these kind of games with something like this are playing a very dangerous game, because by trying to kind of dilute the president's very appropriate apology, he is endangering, in fact, the lives of Americans who could be hurt by further riots in this situation. Now, he's absolutely right in at least one very small sense that the American involvement in Afghanistan is not productive, and we should greatly reduce and remove our military forces from that location. Now, but to say that the president was wrong to say he was sorry for something that we should issue an apology over, because it is a very big deal in that culture to disrespect that book, is simply just pandering to some of the worst elements in American society that kind of think that Americans ought to be free to run around the country and do what they want to do, irrespective of the will of the people of the Afghans in the Afghan society.
And just to stay on this incident itself, I mean, this is not the first time that this has happened. I want to play a soundbite from a White House briefing from back when George W. Bush was president.
Sure.
The president yesterday had a regularly scheduled secure video teleconference with Prime Minister Maliki. He opened the meeting, I believe it was either the first or the second issue that the president brought up, to tell Prime Minister Malki he had heard about the incident where the Quran was desecrated, and he apologized for that in the sense that he said that we take it very seriously. We were concerned about their reaction. We wanted them to know that the president knew that this was wrong, and that the commanders in the field had publicly reprimanded the soldier and removed him from Iraq.
This is not to mention the Quran-burning pastor Terry Jones, who can forget him, and all the rage that he sparked. I mean, this should be religion 101 for military folks, especially those living in Afghanistan. And yet there are reports of some of those Afghan workers who said they tried to stop this from happening and they were ignored. Why does this still go on, Derek?
Well, it's completely inexcusable that it still goes on, and I don't think there's a good answer for that, other than for some reason we have a problem getting through people's heads how serious these cultural violations are and how dangerous they are in being able to whip up these kind of violent protests. And I have to say, the clip you just played shows that, you know, there is an understanding, at least on the strategic level, that the game that's being played in Afghanistan is counterinsurgency, and that means you have to win the hearts and minds of the people, right? Now, that was always the wrong strategy to apply to Afghanistan. We shouldn't have been pursuing a military-first strategy there in the first place. But for Republicans to have repeatedly pushed President Obama into that situation and backed him when he went into it, and then to get upset when apologies are issued for these kinds of violations, really shows that what they were really after in Afghanistan was continued American hegemony and a continued power projection base there, and didn't really care about the will of the Afghan people. And we have, as Americans, have got to understand that continuing a military-first strategy there doesn't make us safer, if for no other reason than incidents like these are inevitable when there's two cultures that don't really understand each other trying to interact like that.
I think it's an important point. And, you know, when you talk about some of the failures in this very long war in Afghanistan, I want to bring up something that's been in the news recently. And this is kind of what's been going on with Colonel Daniel Davis, the 17-year Army veteran. He was simply sick of hearing this pretty picture painted, you know, from podiums in Washington and around the country of what was happening in the wars. And so he put together some documents, some are classified, some are unclassified, and he released some of the unclassified things. He testified in front of Congress, and he released these materials which basically talked about the actual failures and what was actually happening on the war, on the ground in the war in Afghanistan. A lot of people angry at him for releasing this information, but he's one of a very few small group of people to come forward with information like this. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are two things that happened. I think one is that there's not enough people willing to come forward and tell the truth about what's happening in Afghanistan, if for no other reason than what's being played is an information game where we're trying to set perceptions among our opponents in Afghanistan from the military's perspective that we're winning, that we think we're winning, and that they don't know something that we do if they think they're winning. And so we're using the press in a way to try to win a kind of psychological battle against the Taliban. But the other piece of it is that when that kind of information was released, you didn't really see the American media do what needed to be done with it, which was to kind of stop the presidential election circus that goes on nightly on cable news and really get into it, because I think there's been a realization for a long time, for several years, that our military leaders in Afghanistan aren't telling us the truth about how it's going in Afghanistan. And since that's the case, when someone else comes along and has very well documented information showing why that's not the case, that it kind of lands as a kind of so what moment, and that shows the cynicism of our political leaders in keeping us in this war that's not making us safer.
Some really good arguments there, Derek, about perception. I think it's important not just to think about perception in this country, but to remember there are some very different perceptions of this country, of this war around the world that they're putting out there. Derek Crow, Policy Director at the Brave New Foundation.
Thank you.